The laughter started before Alara Whitmore even reached the gate. She heard it rolling across the courtyard of Ashford Hall, sharp and cruel, bouncing off the stone walls like something thrown at her back. She kept walking anyway, her chin lifted, though her hands were shaking inside the folds of her worn shawl. Duke Julian Ashford stood at the top of the stone steps, tall and unbothered, his coat the color of a storm cloud. Beside him stood his steward, a thin man named Harold Gray, holding a rope that led to a small, ragged group of sheep. The animals looked half-starved, their wool patchy and gray, their legs thin as reeds. Villagers had gathered near the fence to watch, drawn by whispers that something humiliating was about to happen to the Whitmore girl. "Your father owed this estate a debt he never repaid," Julian said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Since you have no coin and no land, I offer you something instead." He gestured to the sheep. "These are yours now. Take them, and consider your family's debt settled." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Everyone knew those sheep. They were the ones too weak to breed, too sick to shear properly, the ones the estate had planned to slaughter before winter. Giving them to Alara was not generosity. It was a public joke, dressed up as charity, meant to remind everyone watching exactly where the Whitmore family stood. Alara felt heat rise in her face, but she did not let it show. She had buried her father only 2 months ago. She had buried her pride long before that, the day the estate's men came to take the last of their furniture to cover what they claimed was owed. She would not let this man see her break in front of the entire village. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I accept." Julian's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if he had expected tears, or begging, or at least some flicker of shame. Instead, he saw only steady brown eyes looking back at him, unreadable and calm. It irritated him more than any protest would have. "Take them then," he said, waving a hand toward Harold, "and do not come back asking for grain to feed them. The estate owes you nothing further." The rope was placed in her hands. The sheep shuffled forward, bleating weakly, their hooves catching on loose stones. Someone in the crowd laughed again, a woman's voice this time, high and mocking. Alara did not turn to see who it was. She simply walked, leading 5 broken animals away from the hall that had once employed her father for 20 years, before quietly discarding his memory the moment he could no longer work. The walk back to her small cottage took almost an hour, the sheep slow and stumbling. By the time she reached her gate, her arms ached from pulling the rope taut whenever one of them tried to lie down in the road. She tied them in the small pen behind her house, the same pen that had once held her father's modest flock before illness and debt had stripped it bare. She stood there in the fading light, looking at the animals. Up close, they were worse than she had expected. Their ribs showed clearly beneath thin wool. One had a limp. Another's eyes looked dull and unfocused. They were, by every measure the estate used, worthless. But Alara did not turn away. She had grown up beside her father in these very fields, watching him work with animals far healthier than these, learning things not from books but from years of quiet observation. She remembered the way he checked hooves for rot, the way he mixed herbs into feed when an animal seemed weak, the way he judged the quality of wool not by how it looked, but by how it felt between his fingers. She knelt down slowly, letting the nearest sheep sniff her hand before she touched it. Its wool was matted and dirty, but beneath the grime, when she rubbed a small section between her fingers, she paused. It was soft, unusually soft. Softer, in fact, than anything she remembered from the estate's healthier flocks. She frowned, running her hand along the animal's back, ignoring the dirt and the smell. The texture held even as she moved to different sections of wool. It was not a trick of her tired eyes or her hopeful imagination. There was something different about this fiber, something fine and unusual, buried beneath years of neglect. For the first time since her father's funeral, something other than grief moved through her chest. It was small, and she did not trust it fully yet, but it was there. That night, she sat by her small fire with an old journal her father had kept, its pages filled with notes about feed mixtures, grazing patterns, and remedies for common ailments among sheep. She read late into the night by candlelight, tracing his handwriting with her finger, trying to remember every lesson he had given her without realizing at the time how important it would become. By morning, her decision was made. She would not let these animals die simply because the Duke expected them to. She began at dawn, mixing a simple remedy from herbs she found growing along the edge of her land, things her father had once used for animals suffering from poor digestion and weak limbs. She worked slowly, patiently, letting the sheep grow used to her presence rather than forcing anything on them. It took most of the morning simply to convince the limping one to eat from her hand. Word of what had happened at the hall spread quickly through the village, as such things always did. By midday, a neighbor named Peter Landon stopped by her fence, leaning against the wood with his arms crossed. "You're really keeping them then," he said, not quite a question. "I am," Alara replied, not looking up from where she knelt beside the animals. "Everyone's saying the Duke did it to shame you." "I know what everyone is saying." Peter shifted uncomfortably. He had known her father, had respected him, and there was something in his voice that suggested he did not fully agree with what had happened at the hall, even if he would never say so where the Duke's men might hear. "If you need anything," he said finally, "grain, tools, an extra pair of hands, you know where to find me." Alara looked up then, surprised by the offer. Kindness had been rare since her father's death, and she had learned not to expect it. "Thank you, Peter. I may take you up on that." He nodded once and left, and Alara returned to her work, more determined than before. If even one person in the village believed she was not simply a joke to be laughed at, then perhaps she was not as alone in this as the Duke intended her to be. Over the following days, she settled into a routine. She woke before sunrise to check on the flock, examined each animal carefully, cleaned the pen, mixed feed with the herbs her father had trusted, and spent long hours simply sitting near the sheep, letting them grow calm around her. Slowly, painfully slowly, she began to see small improvements. The limping animal put weight on its leg without flinching. The dullness in another's eyes began to clear. Their coats, while still far from healthy, no longer looked as brittle as before. She kept coming back to the wool itself. Each time she checked it, brushing away dirt and tangles, she found the same surprising softness beneath. It reminded her of something rare, something she had once heard her father mention in passing years ago. A story about a distant breed known for producing exceptionally fine fiber, animals almost never seen in this part of the country. She had been young when he told her, and she could not remember all the details, only the wonder in his voice as he described wool so fine it could be spun into cloth softer than anything sold in the village market. Could these animals, dismissed and abandoned by the estate, actually carry some trace of that rare bloodline hidden beneath years of poor care and neglect? It seemed impossible, and yet the evidence was there beneath her fingers every single day. She said nothing of this to anyone, not yet. She had learned enough about the village and the estate to know that any hint of value attached to something the Duke had discarded would only invite trouble, whether from Julian himself or from others eager to take advantage before she understood what she truly had. Instead, she worked quietly, carefully, letting the days pass without drawing attention. She repaired the fence around her pen with wood scavenged from a fallen tree. She traded a small basket of eggs from her few remaining hens for extra feed from a neighboring farm. She spent her evenings reading her father's journal by candlelight, searching for any mention of the rare wool he had once described, piecing together fragments of memory and half-remembered stories. Slowly, the animals began to trust her. They no longer scattered when she entered the pen. The limping one, which she had begun to call Bramble for the way it once got tangled in a thorn bush during her care, would nudge her hand looking for the herbs she often mixed into its feed. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. Word continued to drift through the village about the strange determination of the Whitmore girl, feeding animals everyone believed were beyond saving. Some laughed, repeating the story with amusement at gatherings and market stalls. Others, like Peter, watched with quiet curiosity, wondering if perhaps there was more to this than a stubborn girl refusing to accept defeat. At the hall, Julian heard nothing of it at first. He had already dismissed the entire matter from his mind, considering it a settled debt and a fitting lesson for a family that had, in his eyes, overstayed its welcome on his land. He had far larger concerns occupying his attention, an estate slowly bleeding money through mismanaged accounts and declining trade, though he did not yet fully understand the extent of the problem his own stewards had allowed to grow. He did not think of Alara Whitmore again for many days. But she thought of him constantly, not with anger exactly, though anger simmered beneath the surface, but with a quiet, burning determination. Every time she knelt beside her flock, running her fingers through wool far more valuable than anyone at the hall realized, she felt something solidify inside her chest. He had meant to humiliate her. He had meant to send a message to the entire village about what happened to families who fell behind, families who could no longer serve his interests. Instead, without knowing it, he had handed her the very thing that might one day change everything. She did not know yet how far this would go, whether her efforts would succeed or fail, whether the softness she felt beneath her fingers each morning was truly as rare as she suspected, or simply a small mercy in the middle of a difficult season. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she watched the sun rise over her small pen of broken animals. She would not stop until she found out. 3 weeks after the sheep arrived at her gate, Elara stood at the edge of her land and watched a stranger's cart roll to a stop on the road outside her fence. The man who climbed down was well-dressed, his coat clean, his boots polished despite the dust of the road. She recognized him at once. Colin Hale, the wool merchant who bought fleece from half the farms in the valley and sold it on to buyers in the larger towns. He rarely came this far out unless there was profit involved. "Miss Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I heard you've taken on a small flock." "I have," Elara said carefully, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been mixing feed when his cart appeared, and she had not expected visitors, especially not one like this. The Duke's discarded animals, if the stories are true. Colin walked closer to the fence, peering over it at the 5 sheep grazing in the pen. His eyes moved over them quickly, appraising, though he tried to hide his interest behind a casual tone. "Sickly-looking things. Can't imagine there's much use in them." Elara said nothing, waiting to see where this was going. "I'll be honest with you," Colin continued, resting one hand on the fence post. "I have buyers who take flocks off people's hands when farming becomes too much trouble. I could offer you a fair price, save you the effort of nursing animals that likely won't survive the season anyway." "How fair?" Elara asked, though she already suspected the answer. Colin named a number that was insultingly low, barely enough to cover a month of feed, let alone the months of care she had already invested. Elara kept her expression steady, refusing to let her irritation show. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I intend to keep them." Something flickered across Colin's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. Merchants like him did not travel this far to make offers on animals they truly believed were worthless. His visit told her something important, even if he had not meant it to. "Are you certain?" he pressed. "Winter comes fast in these hills. Feed grows expensive. A woman alone might find the burden more than she expects." "I am certain," Elara said, her voice firm now. "Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Hale." He studied her a moment longer, clearly unused to being refused, before tipping his hat again and climbing back onto his cart. As he rode away, Elara felt a small, satisfied warmth settle in her chest. If a merchant experienced enough to know the value of wool had come all this way to make an offer, however lowball, then perhaps her instincts about the flock had not been mistaken after all. She returned to her work with renewed energy, though she said nothing of the visit to her neighbors, not wanting word to spread further than it already had. Instead, she focused on what mattered most, the health of her animals and the quality of their wool. Over the following weeks, the flock continued to improve under her steady care. Bramble no longer limped at all, his coat filling in with a thickness that surprised even Elara. The others followed similar paths, their eyes brighter, their movements quicker, their appetite for the herb-mixed feed growing stronger each day. She began to recognize each animal individually, giving them names that reflected small details about their personalities. There was Clover, the gentlest of the group, who always approached first when Elara entered the pen. There was Whistle, the most nervous, who startled at sudden sounds but calmed quickly once Elara spoke softly to him. And there was Old Girl, the eldest ewe, whose wisdom seemed to guide the smaller flock's behavior in subtle ways Elara had come to rely upon. She spent her evenings continuing to study her father's journal, searching for any further clues about the rare wool he had once mentioned. She found a passage, faded and difficult to read, describing a breed brought over generations ago from distant hills, prized for fiber so fine it rivaled the softest fabrics available anywhere in the region. The passage was brief, frustratingly so, offering no clear proof that her flock carried this bloodline, only the possibility, the tantalizing suggestion that what she felt beneath her fingers each morning might be exactly what her father had once described with such wonder. She needed proof. She needed someone who understood wool and fabric well enough to confirm what her instincts told her. That was how she came to think of Margaret Hale. Margaret was an elderly widow who lived on the far edge of the village, known for her skill at the loom. She had once woven fine cloth for wealthier families before her eyesight began to fail, and her hands grew slower with age. Most in the village no longer sought her work, preferring younger weavers with steadier hands, but Elara remembered her father speaking highly of Margaret's judgment when it came to fiber quality, praising her ability to recognize fine wool simply by touch, a skill sharpened by decades of experience that no younger weaver could match. Elara gathered a small bundle of freshly sheared wool, carefully cleaned and combed, and walked the long path to Margaret's small cottage at the edge of the woods. Margaret answered the door slowly, her back bent with age, her eyes clouded but still sharp with curiosity when she recognized her visitor. "Whitmore's girl," she said, a small smile crossing her weathered face. It has been some time since anyone from your family visited. I'm sorry for that, Ilara said honestly. Life has been difficult since my father passed. So I heard. Margaret's expression softened. Come in then. What brings you to my door? Ilara stepped inside the small, dim cottage, filled with the comforting smell of wool and old wood smoke. She unwrapped her bundle carefully and held it out toward the older woman. I need your opinion on something, she said. Please, feel this. Margaret took the wool between her fingers, and Ilara watched closely as the old woman's expression shifted from mild curiosity to something far more focused. She rubbed the fibers slowly, testing the texture, holding sections up toward the window where weak daylight filtered through. Where did this come from? Margaret asked quietly, her voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. The Duke's flock. The ones he gave me, the ones everyone calls worthless. Margaret's eyes lifted to meet Ilara's, and something passed between them, an understanding that needed no further words. This is not worthless wool, Margaret said slowly. I have not felt fiber this fine in many years, not since before my husband passed, when we still wove for the finer houses in the region. Ilara's heart pounded. Is it truly rare? Rare enough that most weavers in this village would not recognize its value, even if they held it in their hands, Margaret said. This could be spun into cloth, softer than anything sold at the village market. If handled properly, it could rival fabric brought in from the larger cities. Relief and excitement washed through Ilara in equal measure. Everything she had suspected, everything she had hoped for during those long nights reading her father's journal, was confirmed in this single moment. Will you help me? Ilara asked. I have no skill at the loom myself, and I cannot afford to hire a younger weaver. But if you would teach me or work alongside me, I would gladly share whatever profit comes from selling the cloth. Margaret studied her for a long moment, considering the offer carefully. Her hands, though slower now, still remembered decades of skill, and something in her expression suggested she missed the work more than she cared to admit. My eyes are not what they once were, Margaret said finally, but my hands remember everything. If you bring me wool of this quality, and if you are willing to learn alongside me, I will teach you what I know. Thank you, Ilara said, relief flooding through her voice. Thank you, truly. They agreed on terms that evening, splitting whatever profit the cloth might eventually bring, with Ilara providing the wool and assisting with the physical work that Margaret's aging body could no longer manage alone. It was a fragile arrangement, built on trust and shared hope rather than any formal contract. But Ilara left Margaret's cottage that night feeling lighter than she had in months. Word of her visit to Margaret's cottage did not spread immediately, though a few neighbors noticed the unusual sight of the Whitmore girl walking the long path toward the widow's home carrying a bundle wrapped carefully in cloth. Speculation began quietly, though nothing concrete emerged for several more weeks. Ilara returned to her flock with renewed purpose, her care for the animals becoming even more meticulous than before. She began keeping detailed notes of her own, recording feed mixtures, growth patterns, and shearing results, building on her father's journal with observations of her own. She wanted to understand not just how to keep these animals healthy, but how to eventually breed them, how to expand the flock while preserving whatever quality made their wool so exceptional. Peter Landon continued to check on her occasionally, offering small favors, an extra bale of hay here, help repairing a section of fence there. Ilara accepted his kindness gratefully, though she remained careful about how much she revealed regarding the true nature of her plans. Trust was valuable, but so was discretion, especially with a merchant like Colin Hale already showing interest in animals he claimed were worthless. At the estate, life continued much as it always had. Julian remained largely unaware of the small, steady progress happening on the edge of his land. His attention was consumed by mounting concerns over the estate's finances, concerns his stewards had kept quiet for far too long, hoping to resolve matters before drawing his notice. Harold Gray, the same steward who had led the sheep to Ilara's gate weeks earlier, found himself increasingly troubled by ledgers that no longer balanced as they once had, though he said nothing yet to his employer, unwilling to admit the full extent of the estate's troubles. Meanwhile, in the small cottage at the edge of the woods, Margaret began teaching Ilara the fundamentals of spinning and weaving, patient lessons that stretched across long afternoons as autumn deepened into the first cold edges of winter. Ilara's hands, calloused from farm work, struggled at first with the delicate movements required at the loom, but she learned quickly, driven by determination and the growing certainty that something extraordinary was within her reach. By the time the first true frost settled over the village, Ilara held in her hands a small bolt of cloth, woven carefully from the first proper shearing of her flock's wool. It was soft beyond anything she had ever touched, pale and fine, catching the weak winter light in a way that seemed almost to glow. She thought of the laughter in the courtyard weeks earlier, the mocking eyes of the Duke as he handed her a rope tied to animals he considered beneath value. She thought of how certain everyone had been that she would fail, that the Whitmore family's final chapter would end in quiet humiliation. Margaret ran her fingers over the finished piece, holding it close to the window where the pale light could catch its texture. For a long moment she said nothing, simply feeling the cloth pass through her weathered hands, testing its weight, its give, the way it moved. "In all my years at the loom," she said finally, "I have not made anything finer than this." Alara felt her throat tighten. "You are certain?" "I am certain." Margaret folded the cloth carefully, setting it aside on the table between them. There are houses in the larger towns that would pay well for fabric of this quality, not the village market, somewhere further, somewhere with buyers who understand what they are looking at. The thought both thrilled and frightened Alara. The village market she understood, small transactions among neighbors who knew her name and her family's history. A larger town meant strangers, meant risk, meant putting herself and her small, fragile beginning in front of people who owed her nothing and would judge her only by what she carried. "I do not know anyone in the larger towns," Alara admitted. "I do," Margaret said simply. "Or I did, once. It has been years, but some names are not so easily forgotten. Give me time to think on it, and do not sell a single thread of this to anyone passing through the village first. Not until we understand what it is truly worth." Alara agreed readily, grateful for guidance she would never have found on her own. She left Margaret's cottage that evening carrying the folded cloth wrapped carefully against the cold, walking the long path home beneath a sky already darkening with the promise of frost. The following days brought a quiet shift in her routine. Alongside her morning care of the flock, she began setting aside time each afternoon to return to Margaret's cottage, learning the slower, more delicate rhythms of spinning raw wool into usable thread before it ever reached the loom. Her fingers, so used to rough farm labor, ached in new ways from the careful, repetitive motion, but she pushed through the discomfort, understanding that mastery of this skill mattered as much as the quality of the wool itself. Margaret, for her part, seemed to draw strength from the renewed purpose. She sat straighter at her loom these days, her voice carrying more energy than Alara had heard from her in the earlier visit. Decades of quiet retirement had dulled something in the old woman, and now, with a real project before her, that dullness began to lift. "You remind me of myself, many years ago," Margaret said one afternoon, watching Alara struggle with the spinning wheel, her brow furrowed in concentration, stubborn, unwilling to accept that something cannot be done simply because everyone says so. "Is that a compliment?" Alara asked, smiling despite the ache in her hands. "It is an observation," Margaret said, though the corner of her mouth curved upward. "Stubbornness serves well enough, provided it is paired with patience. You have both, I think, though the patience is newer to you than the stubbornness." Alara laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar in her own ears after so many months of grief and hardship. It felt good, this small return of lightness, this sense that something in her life was finally moving toward something better rather than simply enduring one loss after another. By the week's end, they had produced a second bolt of cloth, larger than the first, its quality consistent, its softness undeniable even to Alara's untrained eye. Margaret wrapped both pieces carefully, storing them in a cedar chest away from moisture and pests, waiting for the right moment, the right contact, the right opportunity to introduce this work to buyers who would recognize its true worth. Holding the finished cloth in her hands, feeling its impossible softness against her calloused fingers, Alara allowed herself, for the first time, to believe that everyone had been wrong. Snow had begun to fall by the time Margaret received word back from her old contact in the larger town, a cloth buyer named Grace Ellison, who had once purchased fine fabric from Margaret's husband decades earlier. The letter arrived carried by a passing trader, its paper worn soft from travel, and Margaret read it twice before calling Alara over to hear the news. "She remembers me," Margaret said, her voice carrying quiet disbelief. "She remembers my husband's work, and she is willing to look at samples, though she makes no promises beyond that." It was not much, but it was something, and Alara clung to it with the same determined hope that had carried her through months of doubt and hard labor. They packaged their finest piece of cloth carefully, wrapping it in oilskin to protect it from the weather, and arranged for a trusted carter heading toward the larger town to deliver it, along with a short letter Margaret composed herself, describing the wool's origin and quality in careful, measured words. The waiting that followed felt endless. Alara continued her daily routine, tending the flock through the deepening cold, ensuring each animal had adequate shelter and feed as winter tightened its grip on the valley. The flock had grown healthier still, their wool thickening in preparation for the season, and Alara found herself watching them with something close to affection now, no longer simply animals she was determined to save, but creatures she had come to know individually, each with quirks and habits that reminded her daily of how far they had come together. Word of her efforts had spread further through the village by now, though opinions remained divided. Some still viewed her as foolish, wasting time and resources on animals everyone knew the Duke had discarded for good reason. Others, having noticed the health of the flock and the mysterious visits to Margaret's cottage, began to wonder if there was more substance to the Whitmore girl's determination than they had first assumed. Colin Hale returned once more during this period, his cart appearing at her gate on a bitterly cold afternoon, just as snow began falling in earnest. This time his tone carried less condescension and more genuine curiosity. "I hear you've been spending considerable time with the widow Hale," he said, leaning against his cart as Alara approached the fence, wrapped tightly in her shawl against the cold. "Village gossip travels quickly," Alara replied carefully, revealing nothing. "It does." Colin's eyes studied her with new interest. "I also hear the widow has not woven cloth for any customer in years, yet suddenly finds reason to sit at her loom daily. That is curious, wouldn't you agree? People find new purpose in unexpected places," Alara said simply. Colin's expression flickered with frustration at her deflection, but he did not press further, perhaps sensing that direct questions would earn him nothing useful. Instead, he offered a slightly improved price for the flock before departing, an offer Alara declined just as firmly as before. As his cart rolled away through the falling snow, she felt a growing certainty that Colin suspected far more than he let on, and that his patience, unlike hers, would not last indefinitely. The letter from Grace Ellison arrived nearly 3 weeks later, delivered once more by the same weathered carter, his beard now crusted with frost from the journey. Margaret sent word immediately, and Alara hurried through knee-deep snow to reach the small cottage at the edge of the woods, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter, her eyes moving carefully across the careful handwriting within. Alara waited, barely breathing, watching every small shift in the old woman's expression. "She wants more," Margaret finally said, looking up with an expression Alara could not immediately read. "She says she has not seen fiber of this quality since before the war disrupted trade with the northern breeders. She is asking whether we can supply a full bolt, proper measurements, delivered before the spring markets open in the larger towns." Relief crashed through Alara so suddenly that she had to steady herself against the doorframe. "She wants to buy from us?" "She wants to buy from us," Margaret confirmed, a rare, wide smile breaking across her weathered face. "And she is offering a price that would have seemed impossible to either of us only months ago." The number Margaret read aloud made Alara's breath catch entirely. It was more money than her family had seen in years, more than enough to cover feed and repairs through the remainder of winter, with a considerable amount left to reinvest into the flock's growth. But producing a full bolt, properly measured and consistent in quality, would require far more wool than their small flock alone could currently provide, and far more hours at the loom than Margaret's aging hands could manage without significant help. "We will need more wool," Alara said, thinking quickly, "and more hands to spin and weave it in time. I know 2 women in the village who once wove alongside me, years ago, before the work dried up," Margaret said. "They have skill, though it has gone unused for some time. If we can offer fair payment, I believe they would help." "Then we will find a way to offer it," Alara said firmly, though privately she wondered exactly how, given how carefully she had been managing what little money remained from her father's estate. Over the following days, Alara approached the 2 women Margaret named, a widow named Nora Ellery and a young mother named Grace Whitfield, both struggling with hardship of their own since the local wool trade had declined in recent years. Alara offered fair wages for their work, promising payment once the finished cloth sold, an arrangement that required trust on both sides given her limited resources. Nora agreed readily, having known Margaret for decades and trusting her judgment implicitly. Grace Whitfield hesitated longer, needing the income desperately but wary of investing her limited time in an uncertain venture. It was Peter Landon, unexpectedly, who helped convince her, vouching for Alara's character and determination based on the months he had watched her work tirelessly to save animals everyone else had given up on. "She does not quit," Peter told Grace Whitfield one evening at the village well, within earshot of several other neighbors. "Whatever else people say about the Whitmore girl, she does not quit once she sets her mind to something." Grace agreed the following morning, and the small operation began to take shape. 4 women working together through the harshest weeks of winter, spinning and weaving in Margaret's small cottage by candlelight and firelight, producing cloth of a quality none of them had touched in years. Ilara divided her time carefully between caring for the flock, which needed extra attention through the cold months to ensure their wool grew properly for the next shearing, and assisting at the loom, learning quickly under Margaret's patient guidance. The work was exhausting, her days stretching from before dawn until well after dark, but she felt something she had not experienced in a very long time, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. The Duke, meanwhile, remained largely oblivious to the operation growing quietly on the edge of his land. His attention had turned increasingly toward the estate's worsening finances, a problem that had grown far beyond what casual dismissal could resolve. Harold Gray finally brought the full extent of the trouble to Julian's attention one cold evening, laying out ledgers that revealed years of declining wool sales, poor harvests, and mounting debts that had been quietly accumulating while Julian focused his attention elsewhere. "How bad is it?" Julian asked, staring at the numbers with growing alarm. "Bad enough that difficult decisions will need to be made before spring," Harold admitted reluctantly. "The estate's own flocks have not produced quality wool in years, not since the old breeding stock was sold off to cover previous debts. Our trade agreements with the larger merchants have weakened as a result." Julian sat back, running a hand through his hair, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders for the first time in months. He had inherited this estate from a father who managed it poorly, and he had, if he was honest with himself, continued that mismanagement through neglect and misplaced pride, rather than any genuine effort at improvement. "What of the surrounding farms?" Julian asked. "Are any producing quality wool that might help offset our losses through trade agreements?" Harold hesitated, an unusual pause that caught Julian's attention. "There have been whispers," Harold said carefully, "about the flock your Grace gave to the Whitmore girl." Julian frowned, the memory surfacing slowly, distant and unimportant compared to the crisis before him. "The sick animals I gave her as settlement for her father's debt?" "The very ones," Harold confirmed. "Villagers speak of unusual activity, visits to the widow Hale's cottage, talk of fine cloth being produced. I did not think it worth mentioning until now, given everything else demanding your Grace's attention." Julian considered this for a long moment, old irritation flickering at the memory of the girl's steady, unbothered composure in the courtyard that day, the way she had refused to give him the reaction he expected. He dismissed the thought quickly, unwilling to believe that anything meaningful could come from animals his own stewards had judged worthless. "Village gossip," Julian said finally. "Nothing more. Focus on matters that actually threaten this estate's stability." Harold nodded. Something in his expression suggested he was not entirely convinced, and he made a private note to keep a more careful watch on the situation developing at the edge of the estate's land, regardless of his employer's dismissal. Back in the small cottage at the edge of the woods, the four women worked steadily through the final weeks of winter, producing cloth that grew more refined with each passing day as their combined skill improved. Ilara watched the bolt of fabric grow section by section, each inch representing hours of careful, patient labor, each thread a small victory against everyone who had once laughed at her in the courtyard of Ashford Hall. By the time the last snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared along the edges of the fields, they had completed the full bolt Grace Ellison had requested, its quality consistent from beginning to end, its softness remarkable even to Ilara's now more experienced touch. They wrapped it carefully, preparing it for the long journey to the larger town, and Ilara felt a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation as she watched the carter loaded onto his cart for delivery. Everything they had worked toward through the difficult winter months now rested on this single shipment, on whether Grace Ellison would honor her promised price, on whether this fragile new beginning would truly hold or collapse under the weight of expectation. As the cart disappeared down the road toward the larger town, Ilara returned to her flock, now grazing on the first tender shoots of spring grass pushing through melting snow. She knelt beside Clover, running her fingers through the ewes' thickening wool, feeling that same remarkable softness that had started everything months earlier, in a moment of public humiliation the Duke had intended as a lasting joke. The days following the shipment felt strange to Ilara, quieter than the frantic pace of the previous weeks, yet heavier with waiting. She had grown used to constant motion, to hours at the loom pressed close beside Nora and Grace Whitfield, their fingers moving in practiced rhythm as they traded quiet stories to pass the long evenings. Now that rhythm had broken, and the silence left room for doubt to creep back in. What if Grace Ellison changed her mind once the bolt arrived? What if the price offered in a letter proved different from the price actually paid once goods changed hands? What if something happened to the cart along the road? A broken wheel? A thief? Weather turning foul enough to ruin the careful oilskin wrapping meant to protect their work? Margaret seemed to sense her unease during one of their afternoon visits, the loom sitting idle now that the bolt was gone, the cottage feeling almost too quiet without the four of them working side by side. "Worry will not make the cart travel faster," Margaret said, settling into her chair by the fire with the ease of someone who had weathered many uncertain seasons before this one. "Nor will it change whatever answer waits for us at the end of the road." "I know," Alara admitted, "but I cannot help it. Everything we have built these past months rests on this." "Everything you have built rests on more than one shipment," Margaret corrected gently. "You have a healthy flock. You have skills you did not possess before winter began. You have 3 women in this village who now trust you enough to work beside you. Whatever Grace Ellison decides, none of that disappears." The words settled something in Alara's chest, though the underlying anxiety did not vanish entirely. She busied herself instead with expanding her knowledge of the flock's care, spending long hours studying her father's journal for guidance on breeding, hoping to eventually grow the number of animals producing this rare, fine wool, rather than relying solely on the original 5 the Duke had discarded. She also began quietly setting aside small amounts from her dwindling savings, preparing for the possibility that she might need to purchase additional land or grazing rights should the flock grow as she hoped. It was a modest plan, built more on hope than certainty, but it gave her something productive to focus on while she waited for word from the larger town. Peter Landon continued his occasional visits, bringing news from the village along with small offers of help. During one such visit, he mentioned that Colin Hale had been asking further questions among the villagers, curious about the exact nature of Alara's arrangement with Margaret and the 2 other women now spending their days at the loom. "He offered coin to anyone willing to describe what happens inside that cottage," Peter said, frowning at the memory. "Nobody took him up on it, not that I heard, but it tells you something about how much attention you've drawn without meaning to." Alara felt a flicker of unease at this news. She had hoped to keep her efforts quiet until she understood their true value, but clearly that hope had already slipped beyond her control. If Colin Hale suspected enough to offer money for information, it meant he believed there was something worth discovering, and merchants driven by suspicion rarely gave up easily once their curiosity had been provoked. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Peter. "I will be careful." "See that you are," Peter replied, his tone carrying genuine concern rather than mere caution. Men like Hale do not simply walk away when they scent opportunity. If there truly is value in what you're building, he will find a way to claim a piece of it, one way or another, unless you move quickly enough to protect what's yours. His warning stayed with her through the following days, sharpening her awareness of how precarious her position remained despite the progress she had made. She was, after all, still a single woman with modest means, working against both a duke who had discarded her animals as worthless and a merchant circling with growing suspicion, waiting for any sign of weakness he might exploit. When word finally arrived from Grace Ellison nearly 2 weeks after the shipment departed, it came not through the usual carter but through a personal messenger, a detail that immediately told Margaret something important before she had even broken the seal. She would not send a messenger simply to decline, Margaret said, her hand steady this time as she opened the letter, confidence having replaced her earlier nervousness. Messengers cost coin. Buyers do not spend coin delivering bad news. She was right. The letter confirmed not only full payment for the bolt already delivered, at the exact price originally promised, but also a request for a standing arrangement, regular shipments throughout the coming year, with Grace Ellison offering to help introduce their cloth to additional buyers in towns further along the trade routes. Alara read the letter twice, then a third time, scarcely able to believe the words in front of her. Everything she had risked, everything she had worked toward since that humiliating morning in the courtyard of Ashford Hall, had finally borne fruit far beyond what she had dared to hope. That evening, she walked home through fields turning green with the first true warmth of spring, the letter tucked carefully inside her shawl, close to her heart. She thought of her father, of the journal filled with his careful handwriting, of the lessons he had given her without either of them knowing how vital they would one day become. She thought, too, of Julian Ashford, standing at the top of those stone steps months earlier, so certain that he had handed her nothing but a cruel joke disguised as charity. Instead, it had become the foundation of something he could not yet imagine, growing steadily beneath his notice, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself fully. By midsummer, the small operation that had begun with 5 discarded sheep and a widow's idle loom had grown into something none of the 4 women could have imagined only months earlier. Alara used the payment from Grace Ellison's first order to purchase additional grazing land bordering her existing property, a modest expansion, but enough to support a larger flock. She also invested carefully in 2 more ewes from a distant breeder, animals selected specifically for traits that might complement the rare quality already present in her original flock. following notes from her father's journal about careful breeding practices he had once hoped to implement himself. The cottage where Margaret, Nora, and Grace Whitfield worked had expanded as well, a second loom now standing beside the original, purchased with earnings from the growing business and installed with help from Peter Landon, who had taken on an increasingly important role assisting with repairs and heavy labor around both the flock's pen and the weaving cottage. "You've built something real here," Peter said one afternoon, watching Alara inspect the new loom's construction with careful attention. "Real enough that people have stopped laughing at least." "Some have stopped laughing," Alara corrected, though she smiled slightly at the observation. "Others still find plenty to mock, I imagine, simply somewhere I cannot hear them." "Let them mock," Peter said. "Results speak louder than gossip in the end." He was not entirely wrong. The village's attitude toward Alara had shifted noticeably over the spring months. Curiosity replacing outright mockery as evidence of her success became harder to ignore. Grace Whitfield's family, once struggling badly, now managed comfortably on the wages earned at the loom. Nora, too, had found renewed purpose and modest prosperity in work she had once believed lost to her forever. Even Margaret seemed younger somehow, energized by purpose after years of quiet retirement, her reputation as a master weaver being slowly restored among those who remembered her husband's fine work from decades past. Colin Hale had not given up his interest, though his approach had shifted from open offers to purchase her flock toward more subtle attempts at gathering information. He appeared periodically at the village market, asking careful questions of anyone connected to Alara's growing operation, offering small favors or modest coin in exchange for details about her methods, her buyers, her plans for expansion. Alara remained cautious, sharing information only with those she trusted completely, understanding that any details reaching Colin Hale might eventually find their way toward buyers willing to undercut her prices, or, worse, toward the Duke himself, whose interest in the matter she still hoped to avoid for as long as possible. That hope, however, could not last indefinitely. The first crack in her careful discretion came from an unexpected source. Harold Gray, still troubled by whispers he had dismissed months earlier at Julian's insistence, decided to investigate the matter himself during a routine visit to the village market to purchase supplies for the estate. What he witnessed there settled any remaining doubt he carried about the significance of what was happening on the edge of the Duke's land. A cloth merchant, clearly not local, had set up a temporary stall near the market's edge, displaying several bolts of remarkably fine fabric that drew considerable attention from villagers passing by. Harold approached out of simple curiosity, only to overhear the merchant explaining to an interested buyer that this particular cloth came from a small, independent supplier working just outside the village, a young woman who had somehow produced fiber of exceptional quality from an unlikely flock. Harold's stomach tightened as understanding dawned. He purchased a small sample of the fabric himself, feeling its texture between his fingers with growing alarm, recognizing immediately that this was no ordinary village wool. He returned to Ashford Hall that evening deeply troubled, carrying both the sample fabric and a weight of concern he could no longer keep to himself, regardless of how his employer might react to news he had previously dismissed as unworthy of attention. "Your Grace," he said, finding Julian in his study reviewing yet another set of troubling ledgers, "I believe we have made an error regarding the Whitmore flock." Julian looked up, irritation flickering at the interruption. "What error?" Harold placed the sample fabric on the desk before him. "This cloth is being sold in the village market, brought by a merchant from the larger towns, specifically to purchase supply from a local producer. I have confirmed the wool comes from the flock your Grace gave to Alara Whitmore last autumn." Julian's hand moved almost involuntarily to touch the fabric, and the moment his fingers registered its texture, his expression shifted from irritation to genuine surprise. He had handled fine cloth before, imported from distant markets at considerable expense for his own wardrobe, and this fabric rivaled the very best he owned. "This came from those animals?" Julian asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "The sickly, worthless flock I discarded?" "It would seem those animals were not as worthless as we believed," Harold said carefully. "Miss Whitmore has apparently spent the past several months nursing them back to health, and in doing so, discovered a quality in their wool that neither of us anticipated." Julian sat back in his chair, the fabric still resting between his fingers, his mind working quickly through the implications of what he was hearing. The estate's own wool trade had been declining for years, their breeding stock long since depleted through generations of poor management. If this fabric was truly as valuable as it appeared, and if the flock producing it existed just beyond the estate's own borders, it represented an opportunity he could not afford to ignore, regardless of the circumstances under which he had originally parted with those animals. I want to see this operation myself, Julian said finally, decision settling firmly into his voice. Arrange for me to visit her land. Harold hesitated slightly. Your Grace, given the circumstances of how the animals came into her possession, she may not welcome such a visit. I am not asking for her welcome, Julian said. I am the Duke of this land. I will visit whenever I see fit. Word of the impending visit reached Alara 2 days later, carried by Peter, who had heard rumors circulating through the village about the Duke's growing interest following Harold Gray's discovery at the market. He means to come see the flock himself, Peter warned, his expression tense with concern. And likely the cottage as well, given how much has been produced there over these past months. Alara felt a complicated mixture of emotions at the news. Part of her had always known this moment might eventually arrive, that success this significant could not remain hidden forever, especially not from a man whose land bordered her own, and whose steward had already begun asking questions. Yet another part of her felt something closer to satisfaction than fear, a quiet anticipation of finally standing before Julian Ashford, not as the humiliated girl he had mocked in the courtyard months earlier, but as someone who had built genuine success from the very animals he had discarded. Let him come, Alara said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. I have nothing to hide, and nothing to be ashamed of. She spent the following days preparing, not out of nervousness exactly, but out of a determination to present her operation at its very best. She ensured the flock's pen was properly maintained, the animals groomed and healthy-looking, evidence of months of careful, patient labor visible in every detail. She spoke with Margaret about the possibility of the Duke wishing to see the cottage as well, and together they decided to continue their work as usual rather than staging anything artificial for his benefit, trusting that genuine quality would speak for itself more convincingly than any performance. Colin Hale, hearing rumors of the Duke's interest through his own network of village informants, grew visibly more anxious during this period, likely sensing that whatever opportunity he had hoped to exploit, through quiet information gathering, might soon slip beyond his reach entirely, if Julian decided to involve himself directly in Alara's operation. He made one final attempt to secure an advantage, appearing at Alara's gate the evening before the Duke's scheduled visit with an offer considerably higher than any he had previously proposed, along with a warning delivered in carefully measured tones. The Duke will not treat you as a partner, Colin said, leaning against the fence with practiced casualness that could not quite disguise his underlying urgency. He will find some means of claiming what you've built, whether through the land itself or through the original terms of how those animals came into your possession. Better to sell to me now, secure your profit, and avoid whatever complications his involvement will bring. Alara studied him carefully, recognizing the manipulation woven through his words, the attempt to plant fear where confidence had only recently taken root. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Hale, she said evenly, but I intend to face tomorrow on my own terms, whatever they may bring. Colin's jaw tightened with obvious frustration, but he said nothing further, climbing back into his cart and disappearing down the darkening road without another word. She walked to Margaret's cottage early the following morning, before the visit was scheduled, wanting one last quiet moment among the looms before whatever the day might bring. Margaret was already there, seated at her frame, working steadily despite the early hour. You look as though you did not sleep, Margaret observed, glancing up briefly. I slept better than I expected, Alara admitted, though my mind would not stop turning over every possible outcome. There is only one outcome that matters, Margaret said, setting down her shuttle. Whether you stand before him as the girl he humiliated or as the woman who proved him wrong, the rest is simply detail. Alara considered this, turning the words over as she had turned over so much else in recent months. And if he tries to take it from me, claim some right over what I've built, simply because the flock once belonged to his estate? Margaret's expression hardened slightly, decades of quiet wisdom surfacing in her weathered face. Then you remind him, calmly and clearly, that he gave those animals away freely, in front of the entire village, as settlement of a debt already closed. A duke's word, spoken publicly, carries weight even a duke cannot easily unmake. He knows this better than anyone. It is why men like him choose their public words so carefully, when they remember to. The reassurance settled something anxious in Alara's chest, and she left the cottage that morning feeling steadier than she had the night before, walking back toward her own land with renewed resolve. Nora and Grace Whitfield arrived shortly after to continue their work, and word soon passed quietly between them that the Duke's visit was expected before midday. Neither woman showed any particular alarm at the news, having grown confident enough in the quality of their work that even the prospect of the estate's involvement failed to shake them deeply. Let him see what we've built, Grace Whitfield said simply, threading her shuttle through the loom with practiced ease. There is nothing here we need apologize for. Peter arrived not long after, offering to remain nearby throughout the morning in case his presence might prove useful, though Elara gently declined, insisting she would face this particular meeting on her own. I am not afraid of him, she told Peter, and found, to her mild surprise, that the words were entirely true. Whatever else he is, he no longer holds the same power over me that he did in that courtyard months ago. I have built something since then that exists independent of his favor or his disapproval. Peter studied her for a long moment, something like quiet respect crossing his features. Your father would be proud of you, Elara. I hope you know that. The words caught her off guard, and for a moment grief flickered briefly beneath the steadiness she had worked so hard to maintain. Thank you, Peter, she managed. That means more than you know. He left soon after, promising to check in again later that evening, and Elara spent the remaining hours before midday attending to small final details around her land, ensuring the pen was clean, the animals settled, everything arranged as it naturally stood rather than staged for effect. She wanted Julian to see the truth of what she had built, not a performance crafted for his benefit. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, Elara found herself returning again and again to the memory of that first day, the rope placed in her hands, the laughter echoing across the courtyard, the certainty in every face watching that she would fail within weeks. She thought of the long nights reading her father's journal by candlelight, of Bramble's slow recovery from his limp, of Margaret's trembling hands unfolding that first letter from Grace Ellison. Tomorrow, Julian Ashford would walk onto her land expecting, perhaps, to find some small operation easily dismissed or absorbed back into his estate's larger interests. Instead, he would find something he had never anticipated, built entirely from what he had once thrown away without a second thought. That night, Elara sat alone beside her small fire, her father's journal open on her lap though she found herself unable to focus on its pages, her thoughts circling back one final time to the courtyard months earlier, the sound of laughter, the weight of humiliation she had carried home along with 5 broken animals nobody believed could survive. She closed the journal gently, extinguished the fire, and allowed herself, for the first time in many months, to sleep without the familiar weight of worry pressing against her chest. Julian arrived just past midday, riding alone rather than bringing his usual entourage of stewards and attendants, a choice that surprised Harold Gray when informed of it, though Julian offered no explanation for his decision. Perhaps some part of him understood, without fully admitting it, that this visit required a different approach than the public spectacle of months earlier. Elara heard the approaching hoofbeats before she saw him, and she straightened from where she had been checking Whistle's hooves, wiping her hands calmly on her apron, as she watched the Duke dismount at her gate. He looked different than she remembered from that day in the courtyard, though she could not immediately place what had changed. Perhaps it was simply the absence of an audience, the lack of Harold Gray standing beside him holding a rope, the missing crowd of villagers ready to laugh at whatever cruel joke he intended to deliver. Here, alone, he seemed somehow smaller than the figure who had loomed at the top of those stone steps months earlier. Miss Whitmore, Julian said, his voice carrying less arrogance than she remembered, though a careful formality remained. Your Grace, Elara replied, matching his tone precisely, neither warm nor hostile, simply steady. He glanced past her toward the pen, where 5 healthy sheep grazed contentedly in the afternoon sun, their coats thick and well-groomed, nothing at all like the broken, starving animals he had handed over as a public humiliation. His expression flickered with something Elara could not fully read, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of genuine reassessment. May I see them more closely? He asked, and something in the request, phrased as a question rather than a command, told her he understood this visit required a different footing than the one he had established between them previously. Of course, Elara said, opening the gate and stepping aside to let him enter. Julian moved among the flock with unexpected care, running his hand along Clover's back, feeling the texture of her wool between his fingers, much as Elara herself had done that first cold evening months earlier. His expression shifted further as he registered what his fingers told him, the same soft, remarkable quality that had first caught Elara's attention and had since traveled all the way to a buyer in the larger towns. This is not ordinary wool, he said quietly, almost to himself. No, Elara agreed. It is not. He turned to face her fully then, his earlier formality giving way to genuine curiosity. How did you discover this? These animals were, by every measure my stewards used, worthless. Sick, weak, unfit for breeding or proper shearing. They were sick and weak, Elara acknowledged, but not worthless. My father taught me things about caring for animals that your stewards perhaps never learned, or forgot through years of neglecting the estate's own flocks. I nursed them back to health, and in doing so, discovered what they truly were beneath the illness and poor care they had suffered. Julian's jaw tightened slightly at the implicit criticism of his estate's management, though he could not entirely dismiss it given what Harold had already confessed regarding the estate's declining wool trade. "And the cloth being sold in the larger towns?" he asked. "The fabric Harold Gray discovered at the village market? Woven by myself and 3 other women, from wool sheared from this very flock," Ilara said, gesturing toward the pen. "We have a standing arrangement now with a buyer named Grace Ellison, who has expressed interest in expanding our trade further along the routes toward additional markets." Julian absorbed this information slowly, the full scope of what she had built becoming clearer with each detail she offered. He thought of his own estate's ledgers, the mounting debts, the years of declining trade that had left him scrambling for solutions even as this young woman, given nothing but animals he considered beneath value, had built something genuinely profitable within the span of a single winter. "You have accomplished in less than a year what my own stewards have failed to achieve in over a decade," Julian said, and there was no mockery in his voice now, only something closer to grudging respect mixed with obvious discomfort at the admission. "I had good reason to succeed," Ilara said simply. "I had nothing left to lose and everything to prove." Something in her tone caught his attention, a hint of the old resentment still present beneath her calm exterior, and he found himself unable to look away from her steady gaze, so different from the girl he remembered accepting the rope in silence, refusing to give him the satisfaction of tears. "I came here," Julian admitted after a long pause, expecting to find some small, struggling operation I could easily absorb back into the estate's larger interests, perhaps offering you modest compensation in exchange for reclaiming the flock and whatever arrangement you had built around it. Ilara felt her spine straighten, old wariness returning at his words. "And now? Now I see that would be neither fair nor wise," Julian said. "What you have built here exists because of your own labor, your own knowledge, your own risk. I gave you nothing but animals I expected to fail. Whatever value has emerged since then belongs entirely to you." The admission surprised her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the gentle bleating of the flock grazing peacefully around them. "Why tell me this?" Ilara finally asked. "You could have simply attempted to reclaim what you wished, using whatever authority your position affords. Few in the village would have questioned it." Julian considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I am beginning to understand that this estate's troubles stem partly from exactly that kind of thinking, taking without earning, claiming authority rather than building genuine value. My father managed this land that way, and I have continued the pattern more than I care to admit. Perhaps it is time I learned differently." Ilara studied him, searching for any sign of manipulation beneath his words, any hint that this apparent humility masked some deeper strategy she had not yet uncovered. But his expression remained steady, genuine discomfort visible as he confronted truths about himself and his management of the estate that he had clearly avoided examining too closely until now. "The estate's own flocks," Julian continued, "have declined for years through poor breeding and neglect. I wonder if there might be some arrangement between us, not one where I simply claim what you have built, but a genuine partnership, my land and resources combined with your knowledge and success, to the benefit of both." The word partnership hung between them, carrying weight neither had quite anticipated when the conversation began. Ilara considered it carefully, remembering Colin Hale's warning from the previous evening, his insistence that the Duke would never treat her as an equal, that he would find some means of claiming what she had built regardless of how the conversation unfolded. "I appreciate the offer," Ilara said carefully, "but I have built this operation through considerable risk and labor, alongside 3 other women who depend on the income it provides. Any partnership would need to respect that reality, not simply fold our work quietly into the estate's existing structure." "I would not expect otherwise," Julian said, and something in his tone suggested genuine sincerity rather than mere diplomatic phrasing. "Whatever arrangement we might reach would need to reflect what you have actually built, not diminish it in favor of the estate's convenience." They spoke further that afternoon, discussing details neither fully resolved but both seemed willing to continue exploring. Julian asking careful questions about her methods, her breeding plans, her hopes for expanding the flock further in coming seasons. Ilara found herself, despite lingering wariness, gradually relaxing into the conversation, recognizing genuine curiosity and respect in his questions, rather than the calculated condescension she had expected. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Julian prepared to depart, mounting his horse slowly, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested this visit had shifted something within him, beyond mere business considerations. I misjudged you, he said finally, looking down at her from atop his horse. In the courtyard that day, I intended cruelty, dressed up as generosity, and you accepted it with more grace than I deserved. I accepted it because I had no other choice, Alara said honestly. Not because I forgave the intention behind it. Julian nodded slowly, accepting the correction without argument. Then perhaps this conversation is a small beginning toward earning something closer to that forgiveness, though I do not expect it easily, nor do I believe I have earned it yet. He rode away as the sun began its descent behind the distant hills, leaving Alara standing at her gate with thoughts considerably more complicated than she had anticipated when the day began. She had expected confrontation, perhaps even hostility disguised as diplomatic pressure to relinquish what she had built. Instead, she had encountered something closer to genuine reckoning. A man beginning, however reluctantly, to confront the consequences of choices he had made without fully considering their weight. She did not trust him entirely, not yet, and perhaps not for a long while given everything that had passed between them. But something had shifted during their conversation, some small crack in the certainty she had carried since that humiliating morning months earlier. Certainty that Julian Ashford was simply a man defined entirely by careless cruelty and inherited privilege. That evening, she walked to Margaret's cottage to share the details of the visit, finding the old woman still at her loom despite the late hour, working steadily by candlelight. He did not try to claim what we've built, Alara said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's loom. He spoke instead of partnership, though I remain uncertain what that might actually mean in practice. Margaret's shuttle paused mid-motion, her expression thoughtful as she considered this unexpected development. Partnership with a duke rarely favors the smaller party equally, she said carefully, but if his offer is genuine, if he truly intends to respect what you have built rather than simply absorb it, it could open doors neither of us could reach alone. Access to trade routes, protection from merchants like Colin Hale who might otherwise attempt to undermine your position, resources to expand the flock more quickly than we could manage through our own limited means. And if his offer is not genuine? Alara asked. Then you will discover that soon enough, Margaret said, and you will respond accordingly, as you have responded to every difficulty that has crossed your path since that morning in the courtyard. You are not the same girl who accepted that rope in silence, Alara. Whatever comes next, you face it now as someone who has already proven she can build something extraordinary from nothing at all. Alara left the cottage that night carrying those words with her, walking home beneath a sky scattered with stars, her mind turning over every detail of the conversation with Julian, weighing possibility against caution, hope against hard-earned wariness. Whatever came next, she understood now that she would face it on terms very different from the ones that had defined her position in that courtyard months earlier. She was no longer simply the Whitmore girl, humiliated and discarded. She had become something else entirely, something Julian Ashford himself had been forced to recognize and respect, however reluctantly, however much his own pride resisted the admission. The flock that had once represented her family's lowest point now stood as proof of exactly the opposite, and whatever partnership might eventually form between her small, hard-won operation and the vast resources of Ashford Hall, she intended to enter it as an equal, not as a charity case grateful for whatever scraps of consideration a duke chose to extend. News of the duke's visit reached Colin Hale within a day, carried, as most things were in the village, through casual conversation at the market that grew into something more urgent once it passed through enough mouths. He appeared at her gate again that same week, his composure noticeably thinner than during previous visits. "I warned you," he said, without preamble, as Alara approached the fence. "He came to claim what you've built, did he not? Dressed it up in kind words, perhaps, but the outcome will be the same in the end." "He offered a partnership," Alara said, choosing her words carefully, unwilling to give Colin more information than necessary given his obvious agenda. "Nothing has been decided." "A partnership." Colin's laugh carried little warmth. "A duke does not partner with a tenant's daughter, Miss Whitmore. He absorbs what she has built and calls it generosity. You would be wise to secure whatever advantage you can before that happens, rather than trusting empty promises." "And selling to you would be different?" Alara asked, meeting his gaze steadily. "You have offered to buy my flock outright since the very first week I owned it, always at a price far below what it has since proven to be worth. Forgive me if I do not view your concern as entirely selfless." Colin's expression tightened, some of his careful composure slipping. "I have been honest about my interest from the beginning. The Duke has not. That should tell you something about which of us deserves your trust." "Perhaps," Alara said, "or perhaps neither of you has fully earned it yet, and I intend to make my own judgment in time, rather than accepting either of your accounts at face value." He left without further argument that evening, though his frustration was evident in the sharp pull of his horse's reins as he turned back toward the road. Ilara watched him go, aware that his warnings, however self-serving, were not entirely without merit. She would need to remain careful in whatever negotiations followed with Julian, ensuring that any eventual arrangement protected not only her own interests but those of Margaret, Nora, and Grace Whitfield as well, women who had trusted her enough to build something alongside her when few others believed it possible. She spent the following days considering exactly what terms she would require should Julian return with a more formal proposal, listing them carefully in her father's journal, alongside his older notes on breeding and feed mixtures, a new chapter forming within the same worn pages that had guided her through the hardest months of the past year. Fair wages guaranteed for the women at the loom, full ownership retained over the flock itself, regardless of whatever land or resources the estate might contribute. Clear terms regarding profit division, put into writing rather than left to informal understanding that could shift according to a duke's changing mood. She did not yet know whether Julian would return at all, whether their conversation at her gate represented genuine intention or simply momentary reflection that would fade once he returned to the pressing demands of his troubled estate. But she intended to be ready regardless, prepared to negotiate from a position of strength rather than gratitude, whatever the future held. Autumn arrived with a formal letter delivered to Ilara's gate, sealed with the Ashford crest, its contents far more considered than the brief conversation exchanged months earlier at her fence. Julian had returned to his estate after that first visit and spent weeks consulting with Harold Gray, reviewing every possible arrangement that might benefit both parties without simply repeating the pattern of taking without earning that had defined his family's management for generations. The letter proposed exactly what Ilara had hoped for, though she read it 3 times before allowing herself to believe it fully. Full ownership of the flock remained with her, unconditionally, regardless of any future arrangement. The estate would provide additional grazing land at fair rent, along with initial investment toward expanding both the flock and the weaving operation, in exchange for a share of profits calculated transparently and reviewed annually by terms both parties would help establish. Margaret, Nora, and Grace Whitfield would receive guaranteed wages independent of the estate's involvement, protected explicitly within the agreement rather than left vulnerable to changing circumstances. She brought the letter to Margaret that same afternoon, and together they read through its terms carefully, comparing them against the list Ilara had compiled in her father's journal during the weeks of uncertain waiting. "This is more generous than I expected," Margaret admitted, setting the letter down after her second reading. "More generous, certainly, than most arrangements between a duke and a tenant's daughter. Do you trust it?" Ilara asked. "I trust that he has thought carefully about what he is offering," Margaret said. "Whether that reflects genuine change in the man himself, or simply desperate need given his estate's troubles, I cannot say with certainty. But the terms themselves are fair, and put clearly into writing rather than left to his changing mood, as you rightly insisted they must be." Ilara sent word accepting the proposal, though she requested one additional meeting before finalizing any signed agreement, wanting to discuss certain details face-to-face rather than relying entirely on written correspondence. Julian agreed readily, and they met again at her land the following week, this time with Harold Gray present alongside them, along with a solicitor Julian had engaged to ensure the agreement's terms held proper legal weight. The negotiation that followed felt entirely different from their earlier conversation, more formal, more structured, yet carrying an underlying respect that had not existed between them during that first humiliating exchange in the courtyard months earlier. Ilara advocated firmly for the women who depended on her, ensuring their wages remained protected regardless of whatever fluctuations the business might experience in coming years. Julian, for his part, listened carefully, occasionally consulting with his solicitor but rarely pushing back against her requests, seeming genuinely committed to building something sustainable, rather than simply extracting maximum advantage from her success. By the time they finished, the agreement reflected exactly what Ilara had hoped for from the beginning, a partnership built on mutual benefit rather than the old, familiar pattern of a powerful landowner claiming whatever value emerged from land he technically controlled. Over the following months, the operation grew steadily under the new arrangement. The additional grazing land allowed Ilara to expand her flock considerably, breeding carefully according to principles she had developed through careful study and observation, always prioritizing the quality of wool over simple quantity. A third loom joined the 2 already operating in Margaret's cottage, and 2 additional women from the village joined Nora and Grace Whitfield, all earning fair wages for skilled work that had, only a year earlier, seemed entirely lost to a community struggling under the weight of a declining local economy. Grace Ellison's standing order expanded further, and word of their remarkable fabric began reaching buyers even beyond the trade routes Margaret's old contacts had originally opened. By the following spring, a merchant traveling from the capital itself arrived at Alara's gate, having heard of the exceptional wool through connections that stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first knelt beside 5 broken, discarded sheep in her small pen. "They speak of your cloth even in the capital," the merchant told her, examining a sample with obvious appreciation. "Rare fiber, they say, unlike anything currently available through the usual channels. I would like to establish a direct arrangement, if you are willing to consider expanding your trade that far." Alara felt something settle deeply within her chest at those words, a quiet vindication that stretched far beyond simple financial success. The animals everyone in the village had once mocked, the joke Julian had intended as a public humiliation, had become something valuable enough to draw attention from buyers in the capital itself. She agreed to the merchant's proposal after careful consideration, expanding her reach further while maintaining the same careful standards that had made her wool exceptional from the very beginning. The income that followed allowed her to purchase additional land outright, securing her family's position in a way that felt entirely different from the precarious existence she had known since her father's passing. Colin Hale, watching this success unfold from the sidelines, eventually approached her one final time, though his tone had shifted considerably from the calculating persistence of his earlier visits. "I misjudged the value of what you had, from the very beginning," he admitted, standing at her gate with none of his previous condescension. "I would like to discuss a fair trading arrangement if you are willing to consider it, purely as one merchant to another rather than any attempt to take advantage of your position." Alara considered his request carefully, weighing his earlier attempts at manipulation against the practical benefits a broader trading network might offer her expanding operation. In the end, she agreed to a modest arrangement, one that protected her interests while acknowledging that Colin, whatever his earlier motives, possessed genuine knowledge of the wool trade that could prove useful moving forward. As the operation continued growing throughout that year, Julian's own visits to her land became more frequent, though the reasons for these visits grew increasingly difficult to attribute entirely to business considerations. He arrived sometimes simply to observe the flock's progress, other times to discuss potential improvements to the estate's own declining trade, drawing on lessons learned from Alara's success to slowly rebuild practices his own family had neglected for generations. Their conversations during these visits grew easier over time, old wariness gradually softening into something neither had quite anticipated when their arrangement first began. Alara found herself, despite every instinct toward caution built through months of hardship and suspicion, gradually allowing herself to trust the changes she witnessed in Julian's approach, both toward their business arrangement and toward the broader responsibilities of managing his estate with genuine care rather than careless neglect. By the following autumn, nearly 2 years after that humiliating morning in the courtyard, Ashford Hall hosted a gathering to celebrate the estate's improving fortunes, a marked departure from the declining trade and mounting debts that had defined Julian's early management. Alara attended at his personal invitation, standing now not as a tenant's daughter accepting scraps of charity, but as a respected business partner whose success had become central to the estate's recovery. During that gathering, in front of villagers who had once laughed at her humiliation and now offered genuine respect for what she had built, Julian spoke publicly of the partnership that had transformed both their fortunes, acknowledging openly that the flock he had once discarded as worthless had become more valuable than anything remaining in his own estate's declining trade. "I intended cruelty that day," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "and received in return something far greater than I deserved, a lesson in genuine value, earned through labor and knowledge rather than inherited privilege alone." Later that evening, as the gathering wound down and most guests began departing into the cool autumn night, Julian found Alara standing alone near the edge of the courtyard, the same courtyard where their story had begun with laughter and humiliation 2 years earlier. "I owe you an apology I have never properly given," he said quietly, "not simply for that day, but for every assumption I carried afterward about what you could or could not accomplish." "You have already apologized, in your own way," Alara said, "through everything you have done since that first visit to my land, through respecting the terms of our partnership, through the changes you have made to your own management of this estate." "Perhaps," Julian said, "though I find myself wanting to offer something more personal as well, if you would permit it." Alara studied him carefully, recognizing something vulnerable in his expression that she had not witnessed during any of their previous business dealings. "What would you offer?" "Simply this," Julian said. An honest friendship, built on the same respect that has defined our partnership these past 2 years, with whatever might grow from that foundation left entirely to your own judgment and timing, rather than any expectation on my part. Alara considered his words carefully, remembering every step of the long journey that had brought her to this moment, from the rope placed reluctantly in her hands, to the fortune she had built through patience, knowledge, and refusal to accept the judgment others had placed upon her worth. I would welcome that, she said finally, on my own terms, as everything else between us has been built. Julian nodded, understanding fully the weight behind her careful phrasing, respecting the boundaries she had drawn even as something warmer passed between them in the quiet autumn evening. Before Julian left the courtyard that night, another figure approached, one Alara had not expected to see present at such a gathering. Harold Gray, dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, offered a small bow that carried genuine sincerity rather than mere obligation. Miss Whitmore, he said, I owe you my own apology, separate from anything His Grace has already offered. I led those animals to your gate that day, following instructions I did not question, though perhaps I should have. You were following your employer's orders, Alara said. I never held that against you personally, Mr. Gray. Perhaps not, Harold said, but I have thought often, these past 2 years, about what might have happened had I spoken up that day, had I questioned the wisdom of humiliating a grieving young woman, rather than simply settling her father's debt with dignity. I did not, and I have watched you build something remarkable despite that failure on my part, not because of any help I offered. Alara considered his words, recognizing the genuine weight behind them. You have more than made up for that silence since, Mr. Gray, through the trust you eventually placed in bringing this matter to His Grace's attention, and through the fairness you have shown in every negotiation since our partnership began. Harold seemed visibly relieved by her words, offering another small bow before rejoining the thinning crowd of departing guests. Alara watched him go, reflecting on how thoroughly the past 2 years had reshaped not only her own circumstances, but the attitudes of nearly everyone connected to that humiliating morning in the courtyard. Margaret found her shortly after, moving slower now than she once had, though her eyes remained as sharp and perceptive as ever despite her advancing years. You have come a long way, child, Margaret said, settling beside her on a stone bench near the courtyard's edge. Further than either of us dared hope. That first evening you brought me a bundle of wool wrapped in cloth, uncertain whether I would even agree to help you. I could not have come this far without you, Alara said honestly. Your skill, your patience, your willingness to trust in something uncertain when everyone else might have turned me away. I trusted my own hands, Margaret said, smiling faintly. They recognized quality the moment they touched that first sample, regardless of what my eyes could no longer see clearly. Sometimes the truth reveals itself most honestly through simple, patient attention, rather than grand gestures or loud proclamations. They sat together for a while longer, watching the last of the gathering's guests depart into the cool evening air, the estate's windows glowing warmly behind them, a stark contrast to the cold, mocking atmosphere that had defined this same courtyard 2 years earlier. Nora and Grace Whitfield found her as well before the evening fully ended, both women dressed in fine cloth woven from their own careful labor, a detail that brought Alara quiet satisfaction as she noted it. They spoke briefly of their families, their homes now secure through steady income that had once seemed entirely beyond their reach, their gratitude expressed simply but genuinely before they too departed into the darkening night. Peter Landon remained until nearly everyone else had gone, finding Alara alone once more near the courtyard's edge, as the last torches began burning low. You did it, he said simply, no particular surprise in his voice, only quiet satisfaction at having witnessed her journey from its earliest, most uncertain days. Everything you set out to prove, back when nobody else believed it possible. I could not have managed it without help from people like you, Alara said. Your kindness, when kindness was rare enough to matter more than you likely realized. You would have found a way regardless, Peter said. I simply made certain paths a little easier along your journey. The determination itself was always entirely your own. He left soon after, and Alara remained alone in the quiet courtyard for a long while, watching the stars emerge more fully as the last torches burned down to embers. She thought of her father, of the journal that had guided her through the hardest months of grief and uncertainty, of every lesson he had given her, without either of them understanding, at the time, how vital they would eventually prove to be. She thought of the 5 sheep, broken and starving, delivered to her gate as a cruel joke intended to remind an entire village of exactly where the Whitmore family stood in relation to those who held power over their land and livelihood. She thought of how thoroughly those same animals, nursed carefully back to health through patient labor and inherited knowledge, had transformed not only her own fortune, but the fortunes of everyone who had eventually joined her in building something genuine from what others had discarded as worthless. The courtyard around her, once filled with mocking laughter, now stood quiet and peaceful beneath the emerging stars, carrying none of the humiliation it had witnessed 2 years earlier. Whatever came next, whether simple partnership with Julian Ashford or something deeper still, Ilara understood that she would face it exactly as she had faced everything since that first difficult morning, on her own terms, with her own hard-won strength, answering to nobody's judgment but her own. She rose finally from the stone bench, gathering her shawl against the evening chill, and walked home beneath a sky full of stars, past fields where her flock grazed peacefully, past the small cottage where Margaret's loom would resume its steady rhythm come morning, toward a future that belonged, at last, entirely to her own making. Whatever came next between them, whether simple partnership or something deeper still, Ilara Whitmore stood in that courtyard as an equal, not as the humiliated girl who had once accepted a cruel joke disguised as charity, but as a woman who had built genuine fortune and respect from nothing more than 5 discarded sheep and her own unshakable determination to prove everyone wrong. 3 more years passed before the village of Ashford truly understood how much had changed since that cold morning, when a duke handed a grieving young woman a rope tied to 5 discarded sheep. Ilara's flock had grown from 5 animals to well over 200, spread now across land she owned outright, purchased entirely through profits earned from wool that buyers as far as the capital sought by name rather than mere description. The weaving cottage that had once housed a single idle loom now stood as a proper workshop, employing 8 women from the village, each earning fair wages for skill that had, only a few years earlier, seemed entirely lost to a community struggling under economic decline. Margaret no longer worked the loom herself, her hands finally too unsteady for the delicate labor she had once performed with such quiet mastery. Instead, she spent her days teaching younger women the techniques she had spent a lifetime perfecting, ensuring that the knowledge she carried would not disappear with her own passing years. She often sat near the workshop's window, offering guidance and correction, her sharp eyes still capable of spotting flaws in tension or texture that younger weavers sometimes missed. "You have built something that will outlast both of us," she told Ilara one autumn afternoon, watching 2 young apprentices work carefully at adjacent looms. "That matters more than any fortune alone could measure." Ilara had come to understand this truth deeply over the passing years. The wealth she had accumulated mattered less to her, in the end, than the lives she had helped steady through honest work and fair treatment. Women who had once struggled to feed their families now able to build something secure for themselves and their children in turn. Julian's own transformation had continued alongside her success, his management of Ashford Hall gradually shifting from the careless neglect his father had modeled toward something more thoughtful and sustainable. He had rebuilt the estate's own breeding stock using principles Ilara had shared freely, understanding that her success and the estate's recovery were now genuinely intertwined rather than separate interests competing against each other. Their friendship, which had begun cautiously in the aftermath of that first difficult visit to her land, had deepened slowly over the following years into something neither had rushed nor forced. Julian visited often, though rarely now for reasons connected purely to business, and Ilara found herself, gradually and without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, looking forward to his visits for reasons that had little to do with wool or trade agreements. He proposed to her eventually, not in any grand public gesture designed to draw attention or fanfare, but quietly, in the same pen where she had first knelt beside 5 broken sheep and discovered the remarkable softness hidden beneath their neglected wool. "I have nothing left to offer you that you have not already earned through your own labor," he told her that evening, the flock grazing peacefully around them in the fading light. "Whatever I bring to this marriage, should you accept, comes not as charity from a duke to a struggling tenant, but as an equal partner who has learned, through your example, what genuine value truly means." Ilara accepted, not because his title offered her anything she still needed, having built her own security and fortune entirely independent of his estate's resources, but because the man standing before her that evening bore little resemblance to the cruel figure who had once handed her a rope atop those stone steps, mocking her family's hardship in front of an entire village. Their wedding, held the following spring, drew guests from across the county, including Grace Ellison, who traveled from the larger town specifically to attend, and the merchant from the capital who had first sought Ilara's wool through connections stretching far beyond anything she could have imagined during those early, uncertain months. Even Colin Hale attended, His earlier suspicion long since replaced by genuine respect, their trading arrangement having grown into something approaching real friendship over the years of honest dealing between them. Peter Landon stood among the gathered guests as well, having married Grace Whitfield's sister the previous year. His own quiet kindness during Alara's most difficult months finally rewarded with happiness of his own making. He raised his cup during the celebration, offering words that captured, more simply than any formal speech might have managed, the journey that had brought them all to this moment. To the woman who took nothing and built everything, he said, and to the Duke wise enough, eventually, to recognize what he had found. The years that followed brought further growth to both the flock and the weaving operation, expanding steadily under Alara's continued guidance even as her responsibilities grew alongside her marriage, and, eventually, the arrival of 2 children who grew up understanding, from their earliest years, the value of honest labor and patient determination, rather than inherited privilege alone. She never forgot the lessons written in her father's journal, keeping it carefully preserved even as her own notes filled additional pages beside his original handwriting, a record spanning 2 generations of careful observation and hard-won knowledge about the animals that had transformed her family's fortune so completely. The rare breed that had produced such exceptional wool eventually became known throughout the region simply as Whitmore sheep, their bloodline carefully protected and expanded under Alara's continued oversight, their fine fleece sought by buyers, who had once dismissed the very idea that anything valuable could emerge from animals a duke considered worthless enough to discard as a public joke. Julian, for his part, often told the story of that first courtyard encounter to visitors curious about the unusual partnership between the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, always emphasizing the same central truth that had reshaped both their fortunes so completely. "I intended cruelty that day," he would say, "and received instead a lesson I carry with me still, that true value is built through patience and knowledge rather than claimed through inherited position alone, and that the greatest mistake a man can make is underestimating what someone might accomplish when given even the smallest opportunity to prove themselves." Alara, listening to these retellings over the years, always felt a quiet satisfaction settle within her, not from any lingering resentment toward the man who had once humiliated her so publicly, but from the simple recognition of how far she had traveled since that difficult morning, how thoroughly she had transformed a cruel joke into the foundation of a fortune, a family, and a legacy that would extend long beyond her own lifetime. The village of Ashford itself changed alongside her success, its economy strengthened considerably by the steady employment her weaving operation provided, its reputation growing throughout the region as news of the remarkable Whitmore wool continued spreading to buyers ever further along established trade routes. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day had finally settled and her children slept peacefully in the home she had built through years of patient, determined labor, Alara would sometimes walk out to the pen where it had all begun, running her fingers through the soft wool of whichever animals grazed nearby, remembering the frightened, grieving young woman who had once knelt in that same spot, uncertain whether 5 broken sheep could possibly become anything more than a lasting reminder of her family's lowest point. Her daughter Rose grew particularly drawn to the flock from an early age, following Alara through the pen each morning with the same careful curiosity her mother had once shown toward 5 broken animals nobody believed could survive. By the time Rose reached her 10th year, she could identify each sheep by name, understood the basics of proper feed mixtures, and had begun asking questions about breeding that reminded Alara powerfully of her own father's careful instruction decades earlier. "Will I inherit the flock someday?" Rose asked one afternoon, watching her mother check a new lamb's hooves with practiced hands. "You will inherit whatever you choose to build upon what already exists," Alara told her. "The flock itself is simply animals, Rose. What matters is the knowledge, the patience, the willingness to see value where others see none. That inheritance matters far more than any physical property, and it is one I intend to pass to you regardless of what title or land eventually comes your way." Her son, Edmund, favored his father's temperament more closely, showing early interest in the estate's broader management, accompanying Julian on visits to tenant farms, and learning gradually the responsibilities that would eventually fall to him. Yet even Edmund understood, from his earliest years, the story of how his parents' partnership had begun, and he carried forward a fairness in his own early dealings with the estate's tenants that reflected lessons both his parents had worked hard to instill. Margaret lived to see both children grow into their early adolescence, passing peacefully one winter evening with Alara at her bedside, the old woman's final words carrying the same quiet wisdom she had offered throughout their years working together. "You built something real," Margaret whispered that final evening, her voice weak but her meaning unmistakably clear. Remember that, whatever else changes in the years ahead, you built something real, from nothing, when everyone believed it impossible. Alara carried those words with her through the grief that followed, honoring Margaret's memory by ensuring the weaving workshop continued exactly as the old woman would have wished, training new generations of skilled weavers who carried forward techniques that might otherwise have been lost entirely to time and changing circumstances. Grace Ellison remained a steady presence throughout these years as well, their business relationship having grown into genuine friendship despite the distance between their homes. She visited Ashford several times each year, always bringing news of expanding markets and growing demand for the remarkable fabric that had first caught her attention through a chance letter from an old friend's widow. "I never imagined," Grace admitted during one such visit, watching Alara's own daughter now assisting with wool sorting alongside the workshop's older weavers, "that a single sample delivered by cart all those years ago would eventually connect our families so completely." "Neither did I," Alara admitted honestly, "though I have learned, over the years, that the most significant changes often begin with the smallest, most uncertain steps forward, taken simply because the alternative, giving up entirely, was never truly an option I could accept." Colin Hale's trading partnership continued as well, evolving over the years into an arrangement that benefited both operations considerably. His network of contacts across the region opening additional markets that complemented rather than competed with the direct relationships Alara had built with Grace Ellison and the merchant from the capital. Their earlier friction, born from his initial attempts to exploit what he perceived as a vulnerable young woman's uncertain situation, had long since given way to mutual respect, built through years of honest dealing. Julian's own reflection on those early years never fully faded, and he made a point, throughout his continued management of the estate, of treating every tenant and worker with the fairness he had learned, sometimes painfully, through his early misjudgment of Alara's worth. The estate's tenants noticed this shift considerably, their trust in the Duke's leadership growing steadily as years passed without the careless neglect that had once defined his family's approach to managing the land and the people who depended upon it. Peter Landon remained a close friend to both Alara and Julian throughout these years, his own quiet kindness during her most difficult months never forgotten despite the considerable distance her success had eventually placed between her circumstances and the modest farming life he continued to lead. He often joked, during gatherings at Ashford Hall, that he had known the Duchess when she was simply the Whitmore girl struggling to keep 5 sickly animals alive through a hard winter, a memory that always drew warm laughter from those who had witnessed her remarkable journey firsthand. And so the story that had begun with cruelty disguised as charity in a cold courtyard eventually became something else entirely. A testament passed down through the village of Ashford for generations afterward, reminding anyone who heard it that true worth often reveals itself not through inherited position or careless judgment, but through patience, knowledge, and the unshakable determination to prove that even the smallest, most discarded beginnings can grow into something extraordinary. They had become, instead, the foundation of everything she now held dear, proof that even the cruelest intentions could be transformed, through patience and unshakable determination, into something far greater than anyone, including the man who had once meant only to humiliate her, could have ever imagined.